I'm Lizzie, 32, and I worked my way up from part-time jobs and overlooked potential to a respected federal role. No shortcuts, no favors. For years, I supported my ex-boyfriend through training, bills, and every career move he made. But when he sat me down, called me a deadbeat, and left like I was nothing, I made a choice that changed everything. Ever been dismissed or disrespected by someone you bent over backwards for? If so, drop your story in the comments, because you're not alone. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to rebuild after someone wrote you off, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about standing tall and getting the respect you deserve. What happened next, you'll want to hear. My name is Lizzie, and if you'd met me during my sophomore year at Montgomery State, you'd have seen someone constantly in motion. I was always walking fast across campus, coffee in one hand, binder in the other, earbuds in but rarely playing anything. Just a shield, really. Back then, I was juggling two part-time jobs, one in the campus security office, the other at a 24-hour diner off Route 89. I was also carrying a full load of criminal justice classes and trying to convince myself that sleep was optional. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And I took pride in how hard I worked. That's when I met Aaron. He was in my intro to constitutional law seminar, always sitting near the front. Political science major, ROTC scholarship. You could tell. He was one of those guys who didn't just raise his hand to answer, he leaned forward, like the room was waiting on him. Confident, sharp, quick with dry humor that made our professor smirk more than once. One afternoon, after class let out early, we ended up walking the same direction. He asked if I was planning on joining the campus protest happening that evening. I said no, I had a double shift and a paper due by midnight. He raised an eyebrow and said, "Damn, you're really grinding, huh?" I shrugged. Comes with the territory. He smiled, then offered to walk me to the library. That was the start of it. The thing about Aaron was, he knew how to pay attention, at least in the beginning. He'd remember little details, like what kind of granola bar I kept in my bag, or how I always retied my ponytail before big tests. He'd show up at my diner shifts, slide into a booth near the back, and pretend he just happened to be studying. When I finally gave in and let him buy me a coffee after my Tuesday night shift, he told me, "You've got grit. Most people just complain. You actually do something." It sounded like a compliment. We started dating that fall. Slowly at first, then all at once. He'd walk me home from night shifts, sit with me while I worked on case briefs. He started calling me Jules, and eventually left his toothbrush at my place. Somewhere between late-night exam prep and weekend trips to the armory for his ROTC drills, we became serious. He was always talking about his future commission. His plan was to commission as a second lieutenant, then do intel. Go where the real decisions happen, he'd say. I encouraged him. Proofread his applications. Helped him prep for interviews. When his stipend started running dry toward the end of junior year, I picked up extra shifts at the diner. He never outright asked, but it was understood I'd cover meals, gas, the occasional textbook. I told myself it was temporary. That once he commissioned, things would even out. By senior year, I had an offer from the Regional Intelligence Bureau in Arizona. Entry-level, but competitive. I was proud. When I told Aaron, he blinked, then said, "Wait, you're thinking of moving out there alone." I explained that it was a good opportunity. I could get in, work my way up. He scratched the back of his neck and said, "Yeah, but I just got placed at Fort Landry. That's in South Carolina. That's, like, nowhere near Arizona." There wasn't a discussion. Just a pause. Then he added, "You're not really the alpha type anyway. I can't picture you chasing down suspects in the desert." I don't know why I laughed. I think it was reflex. A week later, I declined the job in Arizona and started looking for paralegal roles near Fort Landry. My academic advisor was confused. "I thought you were set on intel work?" she asked. I just said something about priorities shifting. After graduation, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from base. Aaron moved in a month later, once his housing assignment went through. I didn't mind the change. I figured we were building something. I was still working full-time, first as a temp in a law office, then eventually with a private investigations firm, but our lives started orbiting around his schedule. His drills, his field exercises, his evaluations. He'd come home tired, drop his gear on the floor, and fall asleep mid-sentence. I made sure groceries were stocked, kept his uniforms clean, paid the bills on time. When he forgot to pick up his own prescription for 2 weeks straight, I started putting reminders in my calendar. Some nights, we'd eat together in silence, both exhausted. Other nights, he'd vent about his unit, how someone messed up a PT test, or how his CO was writing him about leadership readiness. I listened, offered suggestions when asked. Didn't take it personally when he snapped or tuned out halfway through my stories from work. But things shifted over time. Slowly. He stopped asking about my cases. When I mentioned wanting to take the Foreign Service exam, he said, "Don't you think that's a little out of your lane?" I let it slide. I was used to being underestimated, especially by people who had no idea how much effort it took to build a life from scratch with no financial cushion and no safety net. Aaron had charm, but he also had expectations, unspoken rules about who got to be the star in the relationship. And I think somewhere along the line, he started believing his own press. Believing that his uniform, his rank, his proximity to power made him more important. It wasn't all bad. There were moments, quiet ones, where we still connected. Early mornings with bad coffee, long drives with old playlists, occasional weekends off-grid where we could pretend the world wasn't pulling us in different directions. But those moments started thinning out. And I felt it. The imbalance. The way I was always bending to keep the shape of his ambition intact while mine got trimmed around the edges. I still remember one evening after he came back from a field exercise. We were sitting on the couch. I'd just wrapped up a week-long surveillance job that ended in a successful case resolution. My boss even sent a rare, good work email. I was telling Aaron about it, excited. He nodded, barely listening. Then said, "Hey, my CO said I might be up for an early leadership rotation." "Pretty good, huh?" I congratulated him. Then asked, gently, if he thought we could start planning ahead, maybe save for a condo, figure out next steps together. He shrugged. "We'll see. I'm going places, Jules. I just don't know if you're built for the same track." I didn't say anything. Just looked at the chipped edge of my mug and nodded. That wasn't the moment everything fell apart. But it was the moment I realized I'd spent 3 years investing in someone who only saw me as useful when I made him look better. I was tired. And not just from the long hours or unpaid emotional labor. I was tired of shrinking. Still, I stayed. For a while. Because leaving meant admitting I'd bet on the wrong person. It wouldn't be the last time Aaron called me a deadbeat. But it was the first time I started believing I deserved more. Not in a grand, defiant way. Just in the quiet way you realize a door has been closed for a long time, and maybe it's time to find another one. That moment would come. Eventually. But back then, I still had more lessons to learn. And he still had more lines to cross. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing no one tells you about slow erosion. You only realize something's missing when it's already been worn down past recognition. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Aaron was newly commissioned, navigating a steep learning curve. He was adjusting to his unit, field demands, evaluations, constantly juggling what felt like a dozen moving parts. I wanted to be understanding. I knew the workload. I knew how hard he'd worked to get there. So when the late night started, I told myself it was temporary. When the text stopped being thoughtful and became logistical, grab toothpaste or not home till late, I figured it was just a phase. But small things started piling up. When we went out with his officer friends, usually drinks at some off-base bar or barbecues hosted by senior couples, he'd interrupt me mid-sentence. If I offered an opinion about a current event or brought up something I'd read, he'd gently, almost playfully, correct me. It didn't matter if I was right. "Nah, that's not how it works," he'd say with a laugh, launching into a long-winded explanation while his friends nodded politely. I remember once at a 4th of July cookout, someone brought up new federal hiring mandates for veterans. I mentioned a case I'd worked on that touched on related policies. Aaron cut in before I could finish the sentence. "Lizzie's been brushing up on politics lately," he joked, elbowing the guy next to him. Thinks she's ready to brief the Pentagon. Everyone laughed. I did too, tightly, but it sat in my chest for hours afterward. At home, those kinds of comments started creeping into our private conversations too. Not in fights, just offhand remarks. If I brought up applying to the Bureau's intelligence analyst program, he'd blink, nod, then say something like, "That's pretty competitive. Not sure they're looking for part-time PI types, but you can give it a shot." It wasn't what he said. It was how quickly the dismissiveness followed anything that centered me. I started keeping things to myself. Not because I was hiding, but because I got tired of shrinking every sentence to soften the blow. And the less I spoke, the more space he filled. He'd come home talking about his platoon, about how one guy failed a ruck march, or how someone else forgot radio protocols. It was always framed as leadership stress, responsibility he carried alone. Sometimes it's like babysitting grown men, he said one night as he kicked off his boots and dropped his pack by the door. I swear, they hand out commissions to just anyone now. You mean like they handed one to you? I teased gently, trying to keep things light. He didn't smile. Difference is, I'm built for it. I don't remember what I said after that. I think I just walked into the kitchen and started rinsing out a mug that didn't need rinsing. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. He started spending more time at the base. At first, it was night drills and planning meetings. Then it became casual after-hours catch-ups with his CO. The hours stretched longer. By the time he got home, he was too tired to talk, and I'd already given up on waiting to eat dinner together. We existed in the same space, but it felt like two separate lives running in parallel. He said I wouldn't understand the pressure. That was his go-to when I asked about spending more time together. You're not in it, Jules. You don't know what it's like to have real responsibility. The kind that affects lives. I didn't point out that I'd spent the week working on a case involving a missing teen. That my job required me to comb through surveillance, interview witnesses, coordinate with underfunded departments across 2 counties. I didn't say any of that, because somehow, nothing I did ever seemed to count. I noticed he'd started following a certain kind of woman on social media. At first, it was just a few profiles. Mostly spouses of officers in his command chain. I didn't think much of it. But then I started seeing more accounts, women with big eyes, polished hair, picture-perfect homes decked out in red, white, and blue. Their bios were always some version of army wife, boy mom, prayer warrior. They posted photos of their husbands in uniform, hashtags like hashtag proud military spouse and hashtag duty first. It wasn't jealousy. It was more like a slow recognition that Aaron was starting to idealize a very specific mold, one I didn't fit into. I didn't host potlucks or decorate with star-spangled centerpieces. I didn't wait by the door in curls and pearls. I worked. I was tired. I didn't perform patriotism the way those accounts did. He never brought it up directly, but I could feel it. The unspoken comparison. The way he'd leave those posts open on his screen when I walked in, or how he once commented, "A lot of these women make the service look effortless." Kind of nice, right? I didn't respond. A few weeks later, I told him I was thinking seriously about applying to a federal law enforcement program I'd had my eye on since college. It was a long shot, I knew that. But it was the kind of leap I'd been preparing for quietly. Studying on weekends, updating my resume, talking to mentors who believed I had what it took. When I brought it up over dinner, he didn't even look up from his plate. "You can try," he said, casually. "But we both know you're not exactly going places." He said it like he was commenting on the weather. No malice, no venom. Just certainty. I don't remember chewing after that. Just staring at my fork, wondering how many other things he'd decided for me. That night, I laid awake in bed while he snored beside me, dead to the world. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the Arizona job I'd turned down. The applications I'd paused. The years I'd spent making myself smaller, more convenient. I wasn't hurt. Not in the way I expected to be. I was tired. Tired of being the sidekick in my own story. There wasn't some big explosion after that comment. No shouting match, no dramatic walkout. I brushed my teeth like normal. Got dressed for work the next morning. Kissed him on the cheek before I left. But something in me had already shifted. I'd spent 3 years supporting Aaron's goals, financially, emotionally, logistically. I'd deferred offers, changed cities, absorbed slights that chipped away slowly. And now he'd said out loud what he'd likely believed for a long time. That I wasn't going anywhere. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. And neither did I. Not fully. But the groundwork for that realization had been laid. Not in some single grand gesture, but in the thousand small moments of silence, dismissal, and casual disrespect. And once you learn to recognize those moments, you can't unsee them. Even when love is still technically in the room. It was a Tuesday. Not that the day mattered, but I still remember the way the evening light hit the corner of our living room, how the shadows from the blinds made stripes across the floor. I'd just come back from work, nothing unusual, just a standard surveillance job that had wrapped up early. I picked up takeout on the way home and was still in my jacket when Aaron walked in from the other room. He wasn't in uniform. Just sweats and a faded t-shirt from some leadership retreat his unit did last fall. He was standing still, which was rare. Arms crossed, one foot turned slightly outward like he was bracing for something. I asked if everything was okay. He nodded once, then said, "Can we talk for a second?" I didn't sit down. He did. On the edge of the couch, spine straight, posture a little too formal for our living room. I kept waiting for a preamble, something about how work had been stressful or how we needed to figure out a better schedule. But it came out flat. Not cruel. Just cold. "This isn't working," he said. I stared at him, trying to figure out what this meant. The day? The conversation? Us? "I'm moving forward," he added. "You're stagnant." It took a second to process. I asked him what that meant, what he was really saying. He exhaled like I'd missed the obvious. "You're a deadbeat, Lizzie." The word landed heavy. Not loud. Not shouted. Just placed. Like a paperweight dropped on a stack of everything we'd built together. He kept going. "Be honest. You peaked when you got that community college degree. You've been treading water ever since. You don't really want more. You just want to talk about wanting more." I think I blinked once, then twice. My mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. There wasn't a comeback forming. No big monologue. Just a sudden, sharp clarity about who I was sitting across from. He didn't say anything else. He'd said what he came to say. No questions. No space for me to counter or cry or even argue. I stood there for a full minute, waiting for something. A flicker of guilt. A hesitation. Nothing. I walked into the bedroom, took a suitcase out of the closet, and started folding clothes. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't dramatic. Just quiet. He didn't follow me. Didn't ask what I was doing. I zipped up my bag, grabbed my laptop, my toothbrush, the picture frame from my nightstand that held the only photo I actually liked of us, me laughing, him looking off camera, and left it on the bed. Face down. The drive to my sister's place took a little over an hour. I don't remember most of it. Just the steady hum of the tires and the occasional flash of highway lights. I didn't cry. Not then. Rachel opened the door in pajamas and fuzzy socks. Her hair was up in a lopsided bun, and she looked at me like I was a ghost. "What happened?" "I need to stay a couple nights," I said. "I'll explain later." She nodded and stepped aside. I showered that night for too long. I just stood there while the water hit my back, waiting to feel something other than a weird, hollow hum under my ribs. I wasn't shocked. Not really. But there was something about hearing the words out loud, "deadbeat," that had cemented all the doubts I'd ignored for years. When I finally lay down on the pull-out couch in Rachel's guest room, it was past midnight. I scrolled through my phone without thinking. His name was already gone from my recent calls. Our shared playlist had been deleted. My texts weren't sending. He'd blocked me. Everywhere. The next morning, I woke up to 3 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. One voicemail. I played it. It was Melissa, someone we used to run into on base, a military spouse who worked the admin desk at the gym. "Hey, Lizzie. I hope this isn't weird. I just saw Aaron at the officer's mixer last night. He was with someone. Looked kind of serious. I wasn't sure if you two were still together. Anyway, just thought I'd reach out." I deleted the voicemail. There was no point following that thread. Later that afternoon, Rachel made soup and pretended not to be waiting for an explanation. I gave her the short version. She paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. He said you're a deadbeat? Yeah. And that you peaked? And then She didn't say anything for a full minute. Then, that man has been coasting on his haircut and your loyalty since day one. I hope he chokes on his career progression. I cracked a smile. Small, but real. 2 weeks passed. I didn't hear from him. Didn't expect to. I stayed at Rachel's, helped with her kids in the mornings, worked remote shifts on the PI firm's case backlog. I found a short-term sublease through a coworker and moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a bookstore. The ceiling creaked. The walls were thin. But it was mine. One morning, I stopped by the commissary to pick up something for a friend still on base. That's when I saw him. He was standing near the frozen food section, laughing at something with a younger woman beside him. She was maybe 21. Long hair. Wearing a unit sweatshirt that hadn't been earned yet. I didn't stop walking. Just kept moving down the next aisle. A few days later, I learned from someone else that she was still in undergrad. Apparently studying communications. She'd been tagging him in posts about how supportive leadership starts at home. I muted the account. Not because I was bitter, but because I'd already seen the story. I just wasn't part of it anymore. I didn't need to scroll through curated captions to understand what was really happening. I'd been the unpaid support staff once. The emotional buffer. The silent believer in someone else's vision. This time, it wouldn't be me. What hit hardest wasn't the breakup. It wasn't even the fact that he'd moved on so quickly. It was the way he rewrote the entire narrative, as if the years I spent holding him up had been nothing more than a detour. A soft, unimpressive woman he once dated, now replaced by someone who didn't challenge him, didn't outpace his comfort zone, didn't expect much beyond praise and presence. But what he called stagnation, I now saw for what it was: stability. I had built a life around him because I believed in the partnership. He dismantled it with a single sentence, because he only ever believed in himself. Rachel offered to key his car. I told her no. But the thought did help me fall asleep that night. I didn't retaliate. I didn't beg. I didn't post cryptic quotes on Instagram. I just kept moving forward, quietly, steadily, with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. He thought he was stepping up. But he'd just stepped out of the one thing in his life he didn't deserve. And he wouldn't realize it, not until the night he introduced me to someone who outranked him. But that part of the story comes later. The humiliation wasn't sharp. It was dull, like pressure against a bruise you forgot you had until something pressed on it too hard. The breakup itself was simple. No shouting. No final door slam. Just a few flat sentences and silence. What stuck with me wasn't the loss of the relationship. It was the clarity that came after. 3 years of emotional labor, financial support, showing up and staying late, were dismissed as if they hadn't happened. The dinners I paid for, the uniforms I washed, the Sunday nights I spent listening to field reports he couldn't say out loud to anyone else, all of it collapsed into a single word: deadbeat. Like I'd been background noise in the story of his upward trajectory. Like I was a placeholder until someone more convenient showed up. I didn't tell many people, but I did call Lana. She'd been my best friend since sophomore year, the only person who ever raised an eyebrow about Aaron, and then had the sense not to rub it in when I stayed anyway. She answered on the second ring, already suspicious by the time she said hello. Hey, I said. Oh, she replied. What did he do? I paused. Then, he ended it. The line was quiet for a second. Then, you okay? Not really. Are you with someone? Rachel's. I'm fine. You're not fine. She was right. But I appreciated that she let me lie and didn't make it a big thing. We talked for an hour. I told her everything. What he said. How he said it. The other girl. The blocks. At one point, she exhaled so hard I thought she might hang up just to avoid screaming. I'm not going to say what I'm thinking. I know what you're thinking. I told you he needed an audience, not a partner. But you were the one doing all the real work. I didn't reply. There wasn't anything to say. Eventually, I asked her about her job. Her dog. Her new apartment. Something that wasn't me. That night, I lay in Rachel's guest room staring at the ceiling fan spinning too slowly. The room was quiet except for the sound of her youngest son shifting in the next room. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd built around Erin: supportive girlfriend, unpaid assistant, emotional stabilizer, domestic project manager. I'd put parts of myself on hold, my career goals, my training, even my physical health, to accommodate his schedule, his stress, his ambitions. I felt stupid. Not just for believing in him, but for forgetting to believe in myself. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped asking what I wanted because it was easier to just keep showing up for someone else. I thought I was being patient. Turns out I was being erased. The next morning, I found the folder. It was tucked inside an old milk crate full of documents from my final semester in undergrad. A printed application packet for a federal recruitment program. It still had my scribbled notes in the margins. Deadline reminders. Highlighted requirements. I'd started the application 3 years earlier, before I moved for Erin. Before I let his opinion about what I was cut out for override what I actually wanted. The folder still smelled like the old printer paper we used to buy in bulk. I sat on the floor in Rachel's guest room, cross-legged, and read every word. By the time the kids came home from school, the packet was on the table and my laptop was open. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I wasn't trying to prove anything. Not to Erin. Not even to myself. I just wanted back what I'd shelved. Starting over didn't feel noble. It felt exhausting. I had to dig up transcripts, write essays, find professional references who hadn't heard from me in years. But the process became its own kind of stability. Something to wake up for. While Erin was posting mirror selfies captioned, "Leveling up." Watch this space, I was logging 10-hour prep days and relearning how to shoot straight. I started physical training again, got back into tactical drills. My aim wasn't as clean as it used to be, but my endurance surprised me. Rachel watched me over her coffee most mornings. "You're different," she said once. Not like a total personality change. Just quieter. "I don't have energy for noise anymore," I said. She nodded. "Good. Keep it that way." I stopped checking his socials. Not in a defiant way. More like quitting sugar. You don't really miss it once you remember how clear things taste without it. The girl he was dating now, Amanda, I think, had a highlight reel full of base picnics, military balls, and those over-filtered photos that people take in parking lots at sunset. She had a ring within 6 months. He liked to move quickly when there was an audience. I didn't care. I was too busy memorizing interview material, refining my weapons quals, and reminding myself that survival wasn't the goal anymore. It had to be more than that. I didn't want to just get by, I wanted to lead. The rejection had stripped me clean. Of illusions. Of softness. Of the impulse to wait for recognition that was never going to come. But it also gave me back my name. I wasn't Erin's girlfriend. I wasn't someone's support system. I was Lizzie again. I was the girl who'd once finished a forensics simulation 2 full hours ahead of everyone else in her class. The one who could hold her ground in an interrogation lab. The one who used to dream of field assignments in places where nobody knew her history. Lana helped me prep for the interview panel when the time came. She set up mock scenarios, grilled me on case law, and made me rehearse my story until I could tell it like it belonged to someone else. "You're ready," she said, closing her laptop after our 5th round. "More than ready. Just don't downplay what you've been through. They'll hear it in your composure. You don't need to narrate the fire to prove you walked through it." I nodded. When the acceptance email came in, I didn't scream or cry. I just sat on the edge of my bed and let the stillness wash over me. My training started a month later. Early mornings. Cold evaluations. Long hours spent in boots that never quite fit right. I was one of the oldest in my group. Not by much, but enough to notice the difference. They asked me once what made me want to do this now. I didn't have an answer that made sense to anyone who hadn't stood quietly in a room while the person they loved told them they weren't going anywhere. So I said, it was time. And it was. Because while Erin polished his medals and told Instagram he was becoming a better man, I was becoming something else entirely. I wasn't just moving on. I was building something. Quietly. Deliberately. Without him. And this time, no one would have the power to decide whether I was worth it. I finished the program in early spring. There was no ceremony, no pictures, no social post with a caption about rising from the ashes. I got the certificate, shook a few hands, and went home alone. That night I ordered cheap takeout, turned off my phone, and let myself sit in the silence. I picked the lowest profile assignment on the list. It was in a small regional hub, not glamorous, not central to anything, but it was real work. Quiet, steady, necessary. The kind of assignment that didn't come with applause, but required every ounce of discipline. I accepted without hesitation. The only person I told was Lana. Everyone else just assumed I was doing contract work and investigations. I didn't correct them. It wasn't about secrecy, it was about peace. After spending years watching someone else broadcast every small achievement for validation, I wanted something different. Something that didn't need an audience. I wasn't interested in announcing my worth. I just wanted to do the job. The early weeks on assignment were a blur of long hours, dry reports, and high expectations. The work demanded precision, both in analysis and conduct. It wasn't enough to know things. You had to know them without anyone knowing you knew them. No mistakes. No dramatics. No ego. It suited me. I'd gotten used to operating in the background. But now, for the first time, it was by design. No one was standing in my way. No one was dismissing me mid-sentence or reminding me how unlikely it was that I'd succeed. I kept my head down and passed every qual on the first attempt. I scored high on my psychological assessments and completed a secondary certification in counterintelligence protocol. When they offered me a shadow assignment reviewing flagged personnel files, I said yes. It wasn't flashy, but it was trusted work. It meant they believed I could keep things to myself and keep them straight. Meanwhile, life outside my work stayed quiet. I kept the apartment above the bookstore, upgraded the locks, and started running again. Nothing intense, just long, steady jogs with no music, letting my thoughts catch up with me in pieces. I didn't think about Aaron often. But when I did, it was usually in short, clean flashes. His laugh at some bar. His voice correcting me in front of people. His silence when I told him I wanted more. That version of him didn't feel like someone I missed. He felt like a closed chapter. But closed chapters have a way of slipping notes under the door. It started with a text from Lana. Just a screenshot. A post from someone we both knew on base. The caption read, "Last night's formal was eventful." A photo followed, Aaron, glass in hand, face flushed, clearly mid-sentence, while a superior officer beside him stared off in visible discomfort. The comments weren't kind. A few hinted at drama. A couple joked about someone forgetting how to shut up. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to know more. But a week later, the rumor landed more directly. One of the techs in my office had a cousin stationed near Aaron. We were in the break room when she said his name offhandedly, talking about some mess at a formal event involving a junior officer mouthing off after too many drinks. Some guy from Fort Landry. Name started with an A. Arlen? No, Aaron. Something about him having a reputation for arrogance. Anyway, he got formally reprimanded. Not discharged, just slapped around a bit on paper. I didn't react. I nodded, sipped my tea, and went back to my desk. But the weight of that moment stayed with me. He used to carry himself like nothing could touch him. Like promotions were inevitable, like people respected him because they should, not because he earned it. I used to believe that confidence was leadership. Now I understood it was just noise. The email came 3 months later. The subject line was blank. The sender was a personal Gmail I didn't recognize at first. I clicked before I could second-guess it. Didn't expect you to ghost. Guess I was wrong about who the real Deadbeat was. That was the whole message. No greeting. No sign-off. Just those 2 lines. It didn't make me angry. It made me tired. The irony of it was almost laughable. This man who vanished the second I stopped serving his ambition, now accusing me of abandonment because I didn't linger in his shadow. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because silence was the only language that still held any power. He didn't get access to my time or energy anymore. Not even enough for a retort. Instead, I closed the email, flagged it for archive, and went back to reviewing a file on a contractor who'd falsified a travel record. Every time I passed a qual, Every time I got assigned a case that required discretion and judgment, I felt a little more steady in myself. The work wasn't about revenge, but it did give me clarity. Clarity that his version of me, the one he dismissed, the one he called a deadbeat, had never existed. That was his projection, not my truth. I'd always been capable. I'd always had vision. I just stopped waiting for him to see it. Some nights, I'd get home too late to cook. I'd sit on the kitchen floor, still in uniform, eating almonds out of a Ziploc bag and rereading notes from the day. I wasn't happy in the traditional sense, but I felt sharp, present, in control of my direction for the first time in years. Rachel came to visit once that summer. She sat on my balcony drinking coffee, watching the street below, and said, "You don't flinch anymore. You used to flinch when someone said his name." "I forgot I did that," I said. "You don't have to remember. You just have to keep going." I did. And not because I had something to prove, but because I finally understood that real progress doesn't need to be seen to be real. Aaron kept posting gym selfies, motivational captions, throwbacks to old field photos. But his world looked smaller now, like he was trying to recreate something he couldn't quite find anymore. The curated respect, the attention. Meanwhile, I was building something that didn't need to be photographed. I wasn't chasing redemption. I wasn't trying to win a breakup. I was just doing the work. Quietly. Consistently. And I'd never felt more powerful. The transformation wasn't sudden. There was no moment where I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself, no single achievement that made everything click into place. It happened in pieces, paperwork submitted on time, clean assessments, quiet commendations passed from one supervisor to the next. No one threw me a party. I didn't expect one. But I moved up. Quietly. I completed my second assignment, earned a lateral promotion, and transferred into a role with more clearance, more weight. I still didn't talk about work outside the walls where it happened. I'd learned the value of keeping important things to yourself, especially when other people had made it their habit to diminish them. I stopped posting altogether. My last photo on social media was from 2 years ago, a blurry shot of my niece holding a sparkler in the backyard. It was a happy memory, but it didn't need an audience. Neither did I. Meanwhile, Aaron lingered where I'd left him. Not physically, we hadn't crossed paths, but his presence floated through mutuals like a fog. People we used to know would drop his name casually, sometimes to compare ranks, sometimes to mention an out-of-pocket comment he made at a unit mixer, like he still thought he was charming. Every now and then, someone would ask, "Hey, didn't you used to date?" And I'd nod, non-committal. "Yeah, a while ago." And then I'd change the subject. The truth was, our paths hadn't diverged as far as I once hoped. I kept expecting him to disappear from my peripheral vision, but he didn't. He stayed static. Same rink. Different patch. Rotating through bases like a man chasing a version of himself that never fully materialized. Promotions passed him by, slowly at first, then more noticeably. He was still in, but the shine had dulled. He started popping up more often on fitness pages, tagging new workout routines with hashtags like #accountability and #grinding. There was an undercurrent of desperation to it, like he needed the world to believe he was still rising. But the people he was trying to impress? They weren't watching. And the ones who were still around, fellow officers, admin staff, even a few friends of friends, saw through it. They weren't unkind. Just indifferent. His name didn't carry the weight he thought it did. That used to bother me. The idea that he was still out there presenting himself like a man who'd been wronged, or left behind by someone not ambitious enough to keep up. But the further I moved into my own career, the less his version of the story mattered. He hadn't written it. Not anymore. That was mine. Still, I remembered everything he said the night he ended it. The way he leaned back on the couch, arms crossed, and delivered his speech like it was a favor. The words he used, stagnant, peaked, deadbeat. I remembered his tone. Detached. Certain. I carried that moment with me, not as a wound, but as a compass. Every time I felt like cutting corners, every time the work got too heavy or the hours too long, I'd hear him again. And I'd keep going. Not to spite him. But to keep a promise I made to myself the night I packed my bag and left, no one like him would ever shape my future again. The irony was, the more I focused on building something real, the less I needed anyone to notice. In my third year post-certification, I was assigned to a task force focused on internal vetting. It was sensitive work, reviewing personnel flagged for conduct, chain of command irregularities, financial inconsistencies. Names passed across my desk that I recognized. Some I'd worked alongside. Some I'd only heard about. I treated every case the same. One afternoon, I opened a file and felt my chest tighten, not with emotion, but with recognition. It wasn't Aaron's name on the cover, but his unit, his commanding officer. And one of the incident reports mentioned him briefly in a supplemental statement about an altercation during a training weekend. Nothing major. No action required. Still, I read it 3 times. The incident was minor. He'd spoken out of turn during a briefing, reportedly while hungover, and had to be pulled aside by a peer. The note was clinical, objective, but it was enough to know he hadn't changed. The same pattern. Over and over. The same refusal to listen. The same need to posture. I closed the file and moved on. That night, I sat on my balcony, watching the streetlight flicker in the distance, and let myself feel the quiet satisfaction of being far away from that version of life. The one where someone else's insecurities were my problem. Where someone's approval was the ceiling on what I could try. I thought about writing him back once. A year after the email he sent, the one accusing me of ghosting. Just a short message. Nothing dramatic. Something simple like, I didn't ghost you. I just left the room you were standing in. But I didn't. There was nothing to clarify. The life he'd imagined I couldn't build was already built. Brick by brick. And none of it had his name on it. Lana called around that time. She always knew when to check in, even if we hadn't spoken in weeks. You still good? She asked. Better than good, I said. Just quiet. Quiet's underrated, she said. So is being underestimated. I smiled. Not by me. She laughed. Remind me to never bet against you. The truth was, no one had bet on me in a long time. Not at the start. Not when I backed out of Arizona. Not when I took the low-profile assignment. Not when I started my training again while everyone else was coasting. But I'd bet on myself. And slowly, it paid off. I wasn't rich. I wasn't famous. I didn't have a platform or a highlight reel. But I had respect from people who worked beside me and knew what it meant to show up every day without the need for applause. Aaron never reached out again. Last I heard, he was still active duty, still chasing his next move. Still trying to find someone who'd see him the way he insisted he be seen. I didn't need to follow his updates. I already knew how the story went. I'd seen enough people like him to recognize the arc. They talk about going places, but they only ever go in circles. I don't feel angry anymore. Just grateful I stepped off that ride when I did. Because I didn't just move on. I moved up. And no one had to see it for it to be real. It was a joint training summit, mid-level officers, civilian liaisons, embedded units, cross-branch security contractors. The kind of event where everyone wears their best poker face and pretends to be less curious than they are. I was there in an unofficial capacity. Observing. Supporting a vetting review on the back end. The kind of work I was used to, close enough to feel the stakes, far enough to stay clean if things got political. I didn't expect to hear his name. Not there. Not after all this time. It was late in the afternoon, second day in. The room smelled like burnt coffee and dry erase markers, and people were starting to lose interest in panel discussions. I was standing by a catering table, half listening to a conversation about clearance upgrades, when someone tapped my shoulder. She was Navy. Civilian side, logistics. We'd worked together once, a few years back, on a temporary interagency detail. Sharp, good memory. We caught up quickly, just enough to check boxes, and then she dropped it. Random question, she said. Are you the same Lizzie who used to date an army guy named Aaron? Aaron L. I didn't flinch. I am, I said. She hesitated. He asked about you. Earlier this week. Said your name came up in a list, something administrative, and he did a double take. Said he wasn't sure if it was that Lizzie. I kept my expression even. And what did you say? I told him I wasn't sure. He said you were a different person back then. That it'd be wild if it was actually you. I nodded. You can confirm it if you want. She studied me for a second, like she was trying to piece together what kind of history we were talking about. But she didn't ask. Just nodded once, respectfully, and moved on. That night, I lay in my hotel room staring at the ceiling, thinking about how different that conversation would have felt 5 years ago. Back then, it would have shaken me. I would have gone into overdrive, wondering what he said, how he said it, what people were thinking, whether they saw me through the lens he used to describe me. Now, I just felt detached. There was no apology waiting in my inbox. No follow-up message. No formal attempt to reconnect. Just a second-hand inquiry, vague, soft-edged, careful. Like he wanted to know if I still existed, but not badly enough to own how he'd handled things. And that was the thing. For all his talk about ambition, about being the one going places, he still couldn't walk through the front door of his own accountability. There was nothing to rebuild. Not because I hadn't done the work. I had. Years of it. Quiet, unglamorous, consistent. I'd rebuilt myself from the inside out, new direction, new discipline, new sense of who I was and what I'd tolerate. I had learned how to stand my ground without raising my voice. How to protect my peace without cutting myself off from the world. But trust? Trust doesn't just grow back. It doesn't regenerate like skin. Especially not when someone leaves you at your most vulnerable, then tries to knock again once you're thriving. There had been no apology, no reflection. Just distance and then curiosity. And sometimes, that's worse than silence. Because it says, I noticed you're doing better. I wonder if you'll make space for me again. I didn't. There was no bridge left to cross. No shared language to return to. We had become completely incompatible, not because we changed, but because I finally outgrew the part of me that ever saw him as solid ground. I didn't tell anyone else about the summit interaction. Not Rachel. Not Lana. Not even the few friends I still had who remembered the early days, when I moved across state lines to support a man who said I had grit while dismissing my goals as side quests. It wasn't news. It was just noise. The truth is, I don't hate him. I don't wish him harm. I don't need closure or a conversation. I've built too much in his absence to believe he owes me anything I don't already have. What I needed, what I used to beg for in silence, was recognition. A simple acknowledgement that I had value. That I was capable. That I wasn't just a supporting character in someone else's story. But I don't need that anymore. Because somewhere along the way, I stopped waiting to be seen. I just started seeing myself. The months after the summit passed without incident. I got a new assignment, still regional, still under the radar, but with more operational discretion. I trained 2 junior officers, both sharp and serious, and saw pieces of my younger self in how hard they worked to be taken seriously. One of them asked me during a late shift what made me pursue this line of work. Long story, I said. She nodded. Was it about proving someone wrong? I paused. Then, at first. But it didn't last. She looked at me for a second, then went back to her screen. I didn't elaborate. She'd figure it out in time. It's easy to build your fire on resentment. It burns fast. Hot. And then it leaves you cold when there's nothing left to fuel it. But building on discipline? On clarity? On a quiet refusal to be defined by someone else's limitations? That lasts. Aaron may still be out there, telling versions of our story that make him feel better. Maybe I was a cautionary tale in his mind. The girlfriend who didn't keep up. The one who left when things got tough. The one who stopped being useful and started being inconvenient. But I don't exist in that story anymore. I live in the one where I kept my file clean. Where I showed up to work that didn't come with trophies. Where I moved up without the world watching. Where the people who matter salute me and call me ma'am. And not because I demand it, but because I earned it. 6 months ago, I attended a military ball, not because I wanted to, but because I was assigned to. It was part of an interagency networking initiative, the kind of event where your presence matters more than your comfort. I wore the dress uniform. Simple. Standard. Nothing embellished. Badge visible. Most of the people there didn't know me, which was fine. I wasn't there to be known. I was there to represent my agency, my division, the work. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the kind of night that left a paper trail. Who stood where? Who spoke to whom? Which departments showed up and who they brought with them? I stayed close to a few colleagues. Mostly talked shop. We rotated between polite conversation and scanning the room, watching for senior leadership. At some point, a brass band struck up a formal tune, and the clinking of cutlery gave way to a quieter energy, more formal, more observant. That's when I saw him. Aaron. He walked in wearing his dress blues. Hair trimmed sharp, same posture I remembered, chest forward, eyes scanning. He was with another officer, older, higher ranking. Someone with medals that meant something. Aaron looked smaller next to him than I remembered. Not physically. Just less inflated. I watched him notice me. There was this slight hitch in his step. Not a stumble, he recovered quickly, but enough that I knew he hadn't expected to see me there. Definitely not in uniform. Definitely not standing where I was, talking to the people I was talking to. He approached. I didn't move. Didn't brace. Lizzie, he said, stopping just in front of me. Wow. I didn't know you'd be here. He had that look on his face. The one people wear when they're trying to land on the right tone. Like he wasn't sure if I'd greet him with a handshake or a slap. I nodded once. Neutral. He turned to the man beside him, clearly wanting to do some casual introductions, maybe slip back into that old charm routine that used to work when he needed to appear connected. Sir, this is Lizzie. We used to date. But the commander didn't wait. He looked at me directly. Measured. Then stepped forward and snapped a crisp salute. Ma'am, he said. Good to see you. That's all. Not miss, not agent, not you must be the +1. Ma'am. I returned the salute, steady and clean, held it just long enough to signal recognition, then nodded once and turned back to my colleagues. I didn't look at Aaron again. I didn't have to. In that one exchange, everything he'd ever said about me, the doubts, the put-downs, the cheap jokes, dissolved under the weight of that one word. Ma'am. It wasn't just protocol. It wasn't about gender. It was about respect. Real respect. The kind that doesn't get handed out because you showed up in the right uniform or smiled at the right people. The kind you earn. Quietly. Over time. Through consistency. Through discipline. Through the kind of service that doesn't need to announce itself. That moment stayed with me. Not because it felt like revenge. It didn't. It felt like proof. Proof that you don't have to shout to be heard. That sometimes, justice arrives in the form of a silent room, a crisp salute, and a man who once told you you'd never go anywhere standing silently beside a superior who just acknowledged that you already had. After the ball, I went back to my hotel, changed into sweats, and sat by the window for a while. The city lights below blinked on and off like signals from a different life. I thought about the girl I used to be. The one who paid his bills. Who edited his papers. Who kept her ambitions small because someone she loved told her she wasn't built for more. I thought about the version of me that walked away from that apartment with a single duffel bag and no plan except, don't stay here. That girl didn't need an apology anymore. She didn't need closure. Or vindication. Or anyone to say you were right or he was wrong. She just needed to know she hadn't imagined her own worth. And she hadn't. It was real. It had always been real. It just took time to become visible to everyone else. Aaron never followed up after that night. No message. No attempt to reconnect. Maybe he realized it wouldn't land. Maybe he didn't have the words. Or maybe he understood, finally, that some things aren't his to fix. Either way, I was fine with the silence. Some endings don't need rewrites. They just need to stay closed. Since then, things have continued quietly. I moved into a new assignment, more responsibility, more clearance, less room for error. The kind of work that people assume is done by someone older, someone with more visible accolades. But I don't need to match expectations. I just meet the standard. And then some. A few weeks ago, one of the junior officers I mentor asked me if I'd ever felt underestimated. I said once. She waited for more. I didn't offer it. Because some stories aren't cautionary tales. They're reminders. That being dismissed doesn't mean you don't have value. That being told you peaked doesn't mean you've plateaued. That someone calling you a deadbeat doesn't make it true. Especially when the people who matter, the ones who actually know what it takes to rise, see you and call you what you've earned. Not because of who you dated, or who you used to be, but because of who you are now. That's the legacy. Not the titles. Not the clearance levels. Not the commendations that stay buried in a personnel file somewhere. The legacy is walking into a room where you were once underestimated and having the highest-ranking person there look at you and say, "Ma'am." No explanation needed. No history required. Just that one word. And everything it means. Thanks for watching. Have you ever had someone underestimate you, only to eat their words later? Or had a moment where your hard work finally spoke louder than their doubt? Share your story in the comments. I read every one. And if you've ever been called something you knew you weren't, only to prove them wrong by living well, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about rising above, staying quiet, and letting your success speak for itself.